We watched some shit that's actually. What's the COVID shit like? Could have sworn to God I seen some shit about COVID and fucking vaccines and shit. That'd be kind of interesting. Okay, I think that's what it is. 13 days ago.
Your list. Yes.
I wanted to watch the
painted
shit. I ain't gonna lie. I wanted to watch this shit, bro. And guess what we gonna do? We gonna watch it. I'm finna smash this food. We got hella reactions. We got music videos. We got requests. You know what I'm saying? I got hella requests. Like niggas been DMing me out there, like hella, like you know what I'm saying? Been getting hella DMs, bro. So we gonna get to it. We gonna get to it, chat. Don't need trip. Hold on. I did. We gonna talk after stream, gang. Listen, I'm trying to smash that food. You know what I'm saying? I got that motherfucker getting cold in the beach. This motherfucker getting cold as fuck, bro. Ew. You know that feeling, bro? Like when you trying to eat, but your food is getting cold, but you gotta do some shit. It's the worst feeling, bro. It's the worst feeling, bro. It's like being on semen retention and going to the strip club, bro. It's crazy. It's crazy. Hold on. Hold on, gang. My other phone tweaking. You just said one more? Okay, I'm gonna check it after stream, bro. Cause right now, all I'm focused on doing is just posting this motherfucking link and fucking smashing my food. That's, you know what I'm saying? I just got done working out too. So you can only imagine, bro. I'm hungry than a bitch. Post this link. Sorry, yo, I'm trying, yeah. I just gotta, you know what I'm saying? Mission gotta be accomplished. Hold on. We gonna wait. It ain't nothing. I spent days no food, bro. This ain't gonna kill me. Yo, I ain't even tell y'all, chat. Literally, when I was away, I did a 7-day water fast. And that shit kicked my ass, bro. 7 days, bro. Straight, no food, nigga. Just straight, just hydration. You know what I'm saying? So I know this shit not gonna kill me. It's tough, but it's just like, man, you feel like this shit. Like when that shit is over, bro, I'm telling you, bro, like you could have told me shit. Like I felt like a fucking superhuman. Alright. I think we cool, chat. I think we fucking cool. Alright, so we got, you know what I'm saying? We got rice, seasoned. We got some hummus. I don't know if you can see. We got some stuffed veggies. Actually, that's what we call it. It's like a African plate. But yo, I'm about to smash this motherfucker, chat, and we got some hot sauce. Yeah. All right.
Scenario that was going to result in the extinction of humanity and approximately how long it would take. The problem is that it's already underway on a timescale of decades, and we have created a fragile world that cannot endure this shift. People, should they be preparing? Absolutely. That's quite scary.
Dr. Bret Weinstein is an evolutionary biologist and former professor,
uncovering the world's most pressing and controversial issues and offering his solutions to save humanity from a destructive future.
Humanity is in terrible danger, and the number of existential threats is growing. For example, I am profoundly concerned we are going to squander the lesson of COVID. You can see the complete collapse of journalism, our political institutions, our courts. They all failed. The tragedy is most people don't know that we are still not being honest about the origin of COVID. And the truth is, but our political institutions don't want to talk about it, which is going to mean that the failures are going to come back.
Is there anything else on your list of concerns?
So I have 5 different existential threats that AI poses, and we will go through them. But we have no evolutionary preparedness for living in a world where a computer can out-compete a human being. That's a dangerous world to live in.
Is there anything we can do to prepare or to avert this crisis?
Yes. Here's what I suggest.
Bret, of all these existential threats, is there one that's at the very top of your list?
Yes. There's nothing more dangerous than this, and that is...
This is a sentence I never thought I'd say in my life. We've just hit 7 million subscribers on YouTube, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you that show up here every Monday and Thursday to watch our conversations. From the bottom of my heart, but also on behalf of my dad. Who are you, and what mission are you on? And when I ask that second question, I'm looking at the full body of your work, and I'm trying to encapsulate it maybe in just a couple of sentences.
Sure. I am an evolutionary biologist. I'm a former college professor who has been cast into the role of a public intellectual by bizarre events at my college. I am on a mission, and I'm afraid it's going to sound weird to people. I think humanity is in terrible danger. I think we worry about the wrong things. And
so we do.
I do not have any reason to believe that anything I could do is going to change the fate of humanity, but I feel obligated to try. That is to say, if we're going to be doomed by our errors, and I know something about what those errors are, then it falls to me to try to make that clear to people and processes that might have the power to redirect us. So I'm making that effort, even though, frankly, I think it's unlikely to work.
That's quite scary, Bret.
Yep, I've gotten over that part.
What exactly are you referring to when you say that you think humanity might be doomed?
There's a basic set of premises that just comes out of biology. No species is forever, and that includes our species, no matter what I or anyone else does. But the objective of the exercise is really to stave off extinction as long as possible. And I believe that that is a valid thing to do. It is a vital thing to do, even if in the end we know that no matter how successful we were, we're not going to escape the destruction of the solar system. We're not going to escape the collision of our galaxy into another. And even if we did, ultimately the universe has a fate, and it will take us out with it if we beat every odd. But why are we in trouble? Well, we're in trouble because all creatures are well built for the environments in which we evolved. And human beings suffer from something that my wife Heather and I in our book call hypernovelty. So novelty is the state of something being not what you are evolutionarily prepared for. And human beings are very good at dealing with novelty. But what we're doing in the present is we're creating a rate of change that is so rapid that there is no conceivable way for us to keep up. We cannot adapt fast enough to keep up with the novel influences that we are forcing upon ourselves. And what that means is that with each passing year, we end up ever more poorly adapted to the life that we have to lead. And it's gotten so bad that the environments that we live in as adults don't even resemble the environments that existed for adults when we were kids. The reason that human beings have a longer developmental period than any other creature that has ever existed on this planet is that you need a long developmental period for us to acquire the insight and the nuance in order to be a functional adult. That program doesn't work if the environment in which you are picking up those lessons is unrelated to the environment in which you have to do the adult stuff. It's a non sequitur. So that's why we're in trouble. We have technologies that are powerful enough to destroy us. We have processes that we have unleashed, the consequences of which we can scarcely imagine. And as these things proliferate, the number of existential threats to humanity is just simply growing. We have to rein in that problem. The proliferation of existential threats means that the moment at which we blink out as a species is getting closer. If it isn't this that takes us out, it'll be that. We have to arrest that process.
Of all these pressing concerns and of all these existential threats, is there one that's at the very top of your list of concerns?
Well, they're not even completely separable. So, for example, we are politically obsessed in this country and across the Western world with anthropogenic climate change. I'm sure you've noticed.
What is anthropogenic climate change?
Anthropogenic climate change is a change in the average conditions on planet Earth that is driven by human activity. So the claim is that CO2 traps heat from the sun, causing the mean temperature to rise. That will have impacts on, for example, how much ice persists at high altitudes and in the Arctic and the other cold regions. And that then is part of a positive feedback where, because ice is white, it reflects the sun's energy back into space. So the more ice that melts, the darker the world becomes, the more light it absorbs, the warmer it becomes. So that positive feedback is actually a real reason for concern. However, the increasingly model-driven mania about global warming is at odds with what we understand about models. Models are not a valid test of a hypothesis in a complex system. They can't be. So we are treating these models as if they tell us what's going to happen, and that is not a philosophically valid thing to do. But it is also just simply not in keeping with an understanding of the underlying requirements for functional science. If you were in climatology today and you attempted to publish a paper that said, actually, anthropogenic climate change is only a quarter as bad as we fear, you would have great difficulty publishing that, and you would experience a spectacular decrease in your viability as an academic. So what we can infer from that is that we probably have a lot of papers that point in a direction that the field is interested in promoting, and that we have a dearth of papers that might point in the other direction. So in effect, when we look at the sum total of papers and we say, oh my God, they all say the same thing, we're in big trouble. Well, do they all say the same thing because we're in big trouble and that's what an honest analysis would give you? Or is that just an echo of what we put into the system? So I'm much less worried about anthropogenic climate change. And I'm much more worried about some other threats that, to my way of thinking, clearly dwarf it in magnitude. So we have several problems related to space weather. The sun goes through a cycle, an 11-year sunspot cycle. Those sunspots often release solar flares. Those solar flares are, in general, directed randomly off the sun, and because the Earth is only in one spot, most of the solar flares that the sun flings off don't hit us.
What's a solar flare?
A solar flare is, well, it's really the coronal mass ejection that is the important part. The flare is the thing you see on the sun that looks like a big flame sort of flipping off the sun. When it does that, that actually, in many cases, ejects a concentrated glob of plasma, right? These are charged particles, and they get flung off. They get flung off at speeds that are not consistent. They're not moving at the speed of light. They're moving at the speed of stuff, right? And the speed of stuff is variable. But a couple days after a solar flare that releases a coronal mass ejection in the direction of the Earth, we get a wave of these charged particles.
Across the Earth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that causes things that we are all familiar with. Whether you've seen it or not, this increases the aurora borealis, for example, the northern lights. So it's a very spectacular show, and you probably are aware, maybe you saw it yourself, but we recently had an aurora that reached as far south as Puerto Rico. Right? That's a really unusual thing to happen. And even more unusual is the fact.
So they usually reach sort of the top part of the Earth. Is that right?
Yeah, if you're up near the Arctic Circle,
yeah,
you see these things regularly. The farther south you are, the less likely you are to see them.
Yeah, I saw it in North Sweden and sort of Iceland as well.
Perfect place,
right?
But for people to see it in Puerto Rico is highly unusual, and you would think that indicates that the burst of plasma that hit the Earth was in some way highly unusual, and it wasn't. Something else is going on. That aurora reached farther south than it should have based on the magnitude of the coronal mass ejection, which was substantial, but hardly unprecedented. Now, what most people don't know is that there was a major solar storm that hit the Earth in 1859. It goes by the name of the Carrington event, named for the astronomer who realized that the weird effects that happened on Earth were correlated to something he had seen on the sun. He had effectively put those two, he had seen the flare and then deduced that this was related to it. Now, in 1859, the world was not a very electrical place. In fact, the primary use of electricity was telegraphs. And at the time, this burst of plasma caused those telegraphs. Stations caught fire. The entire network went down. Telegraph operators were shocked at their stations. Messages could be sent even though there was no power being delivered to the system. It went down, and the induced charge in the wires was enough for telegraph operators to send messages over distances. So it was very dramatic if you were involved in telegraphs. But for the rest of humanity, it was a minor event. Now, we live in a very different world. We live in a world where everything has an electrical component. The way our cars function, the way food shows up in the supermarket, the way air travel and air traffic control works, all of these things are heavily electrical. And they are all tremendously vulnerable to the EMP effects that will come with a major solar impact.
What's the EMP effect?
It's an electromagnetic pulse, which is basically an induced charge in electrically active materials. So it's the kind of thing that a big enough one will fry every computer, will take most of the cars off the road. And what we don't commonly know is that our grids, the grids that operate all of our electrical devices, are they operate with these transformers, right, which control the flow of current. These transformers are huge, complicated machines, and if you needed one and you ordered it today, it would take a year for you to get it. If the world suddenly needed 70 of them or 100 of them, there's no telling what would happen. So while we all have the experience of a power outage causing us to lose electricity for hours or days, it is quite conceivable that a solar storm that took out a significant number of transformers could take a continent and turn it dark with no plan for bringing the lights back on. They would go out and they wouldn't come back. Now, this is a ridiculous risk to run. The transformers can be hardened against this. They cannot be perfectly immunized from this effect, but they can be hardened with well-understood architecture that effectively grounds out the EMP so that the transformer comes back on after the event. But we don't do it. So we are running an incredibly large risk of a section of a continent or an entire continent going dark with no backup plan. To me, the risk of that dwarfs anything that might be true about anthropogenic climate change. What's more, you've probably heard that pole shifts happen, that the North Pole isn't always where the North Pole currently is, and that sometimes these things flip. That's always struck me as an extremely dangerous condition. And I always assumed, well, what are the chances you're going to be alive? You know, if you were alive within 500 years of a pole flip, that would be kind of a close call. split. What are the chances it's going to happen during your lifetime? Well, we are actually living in a moment where the pole is actively migrating. We are in the midst of what's called a polar excursion. The pole seems to be flipping. And it seems to be flipping at the same time that our electromagnetic field of the Earth is decreasing. Now, that decreasing field means that what's flung off the sun has a bigger impact on Earth than it would ordinarily have. And that pole flip threatens chaos. You can imagine if we feared Y2K, right, that a programming error, a failure to account for the fact that you were going to have this turnover in the dates, worried people, that an actual pole flip would create chaos. And the fact that we are not at least as worried, if not 10 times as worried, about the fact that we are living through a polar excursion and a radical decrease in the strength of our electromagnetic field on Earth says that we just have our priorities wrong.
What is causing the pole to flip, and what does that mean? Because when I think about a pole flip, does that mean the North Pole just moves a little bit, the South Pole moves a little bit?
It's not a little bit. These things are going to move radically, and the rate at which they are moving is accelerating. This is happening on a time scale that's highly relevant to you and me. We are both likely to be here to see the full shift, whatever that full shift entails, and they're not always the same, so it's a little hard to predict. Now, I will say this is not my area of expertise. I have learned tremendously from others. Ben Davidson being the primary person, somebody I had on the DarkHorse podcast. And he has a very compelling model, a hypothesis that I believe does explain many otherwise difficult to explain features of our solar environment. His explanation is that the solar system is moving constantly within the galaxy, and that the galaxy, by its very nature, contains an oscillating electromagnetic sheet. And as the solar system moves through that sheet, we cross the plane in the middle, which causes all the electrically active entities to experience an inversion. The sun experiences an inversion, the other planets experience an inversion, the Earth experiences an inversion.
When you say inversion, you mean the sort of electromagnetic sense?
Yeah, it's the direction of pull. When we talk about electromagnetism, we're talking about attraction and repulsion. And if you imagine that you flipped the sign on everything because you just crossed the middle of something, like, if you were holding a magnet here, right, and the north side is down and the south side is up, and you moved another magnet by it, the direction of pull would shift as you crossed that equator. Mm-hmm. So we are crossing something like an equator of the galaxy, and that cross is causing anomalous behavior on Earth, but it's also causing it, we know, on 8 of the 9 other planets, and the 9th planet, we just simply don't have the data yet. It's not that we know it, it's somehow immune to it. And we're seeing anomalous behavior on the sun. So
8th planet?
What I understand is that there's a story about the galaxy that we barely know. That story interfaces with many things that we do know from the fossil record, from geology, which are hard to explain. Why does the pole flip? And that at the very least, we need a concentrated effort where we look into these questions. And if Ben Davidson has it wrong, if there is no galactic current sheet, if we are not crossing its meridian, if the electromagnetic field is decreasing but is about to turn around rather than continue to decline, then we should find that out. But I think what we would find out if we looked deeply into this, if we took it seriously, is that there is a threat to humanity that has very little to do with anything anthropogenic. The only important component that is anthropogenic is that we have created a fragile world that cannot endure this shift.
What does anthropogenic mean, the word?
Human-made.
Human-made, okay.
Human-made. So, anthropogenic climate change means that we put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere that wasn't there before, which we certainly have.
Yeah.
Our fuels are made of carbon, and when we break these more complex carbon molecules, carbon dioxide is released. That's not really a bad thing inherently, because carbon dioxide isn't a poison, right? So taking these rings of carbon and breaking it into carbon dioxide and water is not the worst way to get energy if you can do it cleanly. But the problem is there's an old equation called the Arrhenius equation, which tells us that CO2 will actually cause the retention of heat from the sun. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact of trapping a little extra heat might not be that important were it not for the fact that there's a positive feedback that involves the whiteness of the poles, the amount of energy bounced back into space, which keeps us cool. And as the poles melt, the Earth becomes darker, it traps more heat. So that's an anthropogenic effect because we've released all of this carbon that was trapped in fossil fuel deposits.
So on this point of the poles shifting, I just want to make sure I'm super clear. Do you actually mean that the North and South Pole would move?
Well, this is, in my opinion, up in the air. Very serious people have inferred from various kinds of evidence that the Earth itself might actually rotate or appear to rotate, that the crust, that is the surface that we live on, could unlock from the mantle. Currently, they are locked together, but it could unlock and rotate over the surface of the mantle. Now, I am not convinced that that can happen. I'm not convinced it's impossible. People as smart as Einstein have considered this possibility, and that in fact it would be driven to happen by the accumulated mass on the pole in the form of ice, that would actually drag it towards the equator if they became unlocked. So we have really two different disaster scenarios that could unfold. One involves simply the magnetic orientation of the Earth shifting and leaving the crust where it is, and the other involving the crust actually rotating. The reason that I am doubtful about the crust rotating, and I wouldn't bet strongly in either direction, but the reason that I am doubtful is that as a biologist, I find the idea that the pole would move to the equator hard to reconcile with the distribution of species that we see on the Earth. So there's something that doesn't quite fit about that story for me. It would require something in the biology that I believe is not described. It's possible. I can imagine things that would do it, but I don't see it. So I'm hesitant about the idea of the crust unlocking, but I don't regard it as nothing to worry about. Just
so I'm clear, when you point to evolutionary history having and sort of the distribution of species on the Earth giving a clue, are you essentially saying that if this had happened in the past, we wouldn't see through the fossil records that certain species exist around the equator?
Yeah, and let's take the example of the Amazon. So there's a very famous biological experiment by kind of an old school biologist who I did have the good fortune of meeting many years ago, a guy named Paul Collinvaux, who was testing the question. There was a debate in biology about whether or not the Amazon became a grassland during glaciation and became a forest during interglacial periods. And he went on one of these sort of old school excursions into the Amazon to take pollen cores from lakes, which is interesting. It's not a lake-filled environment. But anyway, he found locations, took these pollen cores, which should tell the tale, because we can tell which pollen you're looking at, and it gets laid down in layers. And so if it was flipping back and forth between a grassland and a forest, you could see it. That was not what they came up with. What they came up with is this has been a forest, and it has remained a forest without being a grassland. Now, the problem is, if you move it 90 degrees off, that should drive all of the creatures there extinct, and you should have to go through some process that causes either massive migration from somewhere else or re-evolution. And the problem is this model in which we are passing through this electromagnetic sheet every 12,000 years just doesn't leave time for these processes. So you would expect the Amazon would have many fewer species in it than it does. And I will tell you, as somebody who has worked in the neotropics, including the Amazon, one of the paradoxes about the creatures that are in this environment is that they are absolutely ferocious competitors that are very fragile. They require very narrow sets of conditions in order to live. So the idea that there's some radical upheaval in their climate that leaves them standing, it's hard for me to square. But anyway, what I would love is for a robust scientific institution of some kind to delve deeply into the set of questions involving this apparent 12,000-year disaster cycle, the electromagnetic sheet in the galaxy, our location in that pattern, and figure out what we do need to worry about and what we don't.
And if it's not that second possibility that the crust itself is just sort of is shifting and the mantle is staying in the same position, the first possibility is that there's just a movement of sort of electromagnetic poles.
Yeah.
The North and South poles stay in the same place, but
the axis of rotation could stay in the same place.
Right, okay.
And then the poles migrate to somewhere new. And my understanding is that migration is not the simple thing that I and probably you learned when you heard that there was a pole shift, where you hear it's like, whoop, it just flips over. They are migrating around, and actually the path of migration is something that is being tracked, not widely discussed for some reason, but it is being tracked, and it's accelerating, as I mentioned.
What's the risk of that, and how long does something like that take if we think back to our history?
Well, I'm coming to understand this, and what I'm recognizing is that the rate is far faster than I had understood, and that it's already underway. So that's an interesting fact. We're talking about on the scale of decades. We are in the middle of a solar maximum in the sunspot cycle. So that aurora that you
2040
saw,
gonna be
I
interesting.
guess a month and a half or so ago, that was part of this very active period of sunspots in which we took a very substantial coronal mass ejection. That pattern of sunspots will wane, and we will go into a period of calm, during which presumably the magnetic field will continue to decrease, and then the sunspots will return 11 years down the road.
11 years?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And so I am concerned that probably we get away with it. The level of decrease in the magnetic field is substantial, but that we still have enough protection from it that we will get through this sunspot cycle and be unscathed, and then we'll have a period of calm while the electromagnetic field continues to decrease. And then the next sunspot cycle will be much more perilous. Now, this can change tomorrow, right? These sunspots come around the sun, and then they disappear onto the other side, and it takes a month to do a full cycle. New sunspots are being born. A monster could arrive tomorrow. It could rotate and point to the Earth, and it could fling off a coronal mass ejection at the wrong moment, or not. There's a lot of luck of the draw in there, but we should be paying a lot more attention than we are.
And what could we do to prepare? Or to sort of avoid the catastrophe?
It depends on how catastrophic it is. And what I would say is I'm somebody who, for whatever reason, I sometimes struggle with mundane day-to-day organizational tasks, but I'm very good in an emergency. And the emergency answer is pretty clear here, which is you get your house in order, right? You look at the fragility of our world.
That's what I'm saying.
And you start with the low-hanging fruit. You take care of the stuff that's low cost and high impact in terms of increasing our robustness, and you do that first. So top two things on my list would be you harden the grids by retrofitting these transformers so that they ground out rather than fry. That's one. And the second one is you look at our nuclear reactors and you realize that we've been setting ourselves up. We built a doomsday device.
Yeah,
I think accidentally.
that's the dumbest shit ever, bro.
And the problem
That's
is
the dumbest
a
shit ever,
compound
bro.
problem. What I didn't know about nuclear
it's not
reactors
dumb.
until
It
the
seems
Fukushima
dumb.
accident, at which point I did a lot of research,
But niggas
is that
strategically
they are
moving these
absolutely
pieces,
dependent
bro.
on an electrical supply to keep them from melting down.
Wait, what
You have
say?
to have an energy supply. They are absolutely dependent on an electrical supply to keep them from melting down. You have to have an energy input. Now, if you have something like an earthquake, a tsunami, a disruption, the reactors will shut themselves down if they have time. But that doesn't get you out of the woods because you have to put energy in order to keep the cooling water flowing. And that cooling water is not just about keeping the reactors cool. It's also about keeping the fuel pools cool. So the fuel pools are where fuel is taken after it's removed from the reactor. Now, for something like 5 years, a set of rods taken out of a reactor is releasing what's called decay heat. That decay heat is sufficient to boil the water out of these fuel pools if you're not constantly circulating new cold water in there. So these fuel pools look like they're unimportant.
Yo, Korea
But
is
if you
cooked,
cut the
chat.
power,
I swear to
you've
God.
started the stopwatch.
Korea,
Right? That water is going to boil off.
Iran,
and when that water boils off, they're going to catch
USA,
fire. The cladding on the
Russia,
rods will literally catch fire from the
they
heat.
are cooked.
Now, the reactors, for reasons that are almost too boring to recount, contain not only the fuel rods from the most recent 5 years of refuelings, but they also contain decades of rods that we never found any other solution for. Stuff.
What are these rods? These are sort of nuclear rods.
Yeah, these are nuclear. Basically, they are physical rods clad in something called zirconium that contain fuel pellets. This is
Zirconium.
uranium that has been packed in a particular way. These rods get loaded into the reactor. And then there's another set of rods that are used to modulate how much the rods interact with each other. You pull the modulator out and you get a chain reaction. You put the rods, the control rods back in, and it tamps down the reaction. So in an earthquake, you tamp down the reaction, right? And then you're not putting out power, but you do need to put power in to keep it cool. If the power goes and the water boils off, the thing will explode. As we saw in Fukushima, you had a situation in which the cooling water literally got torn apart into hydrogen and oxygen. So it goes from a coolant to an explosive. And we had multiple explosions where the hydrogen-oxygen mixture just blew the buildings apart. But the rods that have been stored for decades in these pools, and the pools literally sit there right next to the reactor. So if you lose control of one of these reactors, it threatens to take out the pool, right? Mm-hmm. And the pool can go dry if you can't circulate water through it. The pool can crack and all the water can drain out, and then there's not even a way that you could put water in and stop it. And my point is that when that happens, it's going to create a fire. That fire is going to start spewing highly radioactive material into the atmosphere right around the plant. That's going to make it impossible for human beings to do even the heroic stuff that we've seen in both Fukushima and Chernobyl, and you're going to lose control of the site. Now, combine what I just told you with the fact that we have a grid that is vulnerable to going down and not coming back up for months. And the question is, well, do we start losing nuclear reactors? Things that,
you know what's crazy, chat?
Keep power.
All this shit is just waiting to happen, bro. Like it's waiting to happen. It's just whenever the sun decides, whoop, here goes some solar flares, nigga. We're cooked.
Power flowing to them could remain cool and not blow up, but as soon as we lose control of them, boom. There are 400 nuclear reactors on Earth today, civilian nuclear reactors, the world will look like a very different place if they all lose not only the containment of the reactor itself, but all the built-up material that exists in those fuel pools. Right? Some of the isotopes in those fuel pools have half-lives of 200,000 years.
Jeez.
So you don't want to live in a world in which these things have gotten away from us and all of that radioactive material has been liberated into the atmosphere by fires. So, second thing on my list, right after hardening the grid by improving these transformers, is that you take all of the fuel in the spent fuel pools that is cool enough to remove, and you put it into what's called dry cask storage. Dry cask storage are these sort of fancy containers that don't require you to circulate water through them. They just sit there inert. All right, you could leave them for 1,000 years. So the risk to humanity would be hugely decreased if we took all of the fuel that doesn't have to be in the pools and we got it out of there and we put it in a place that we don't have to pay attention to it in order for it to remain contained.
Why don't people do that?
It costs money.
It's too expensive.
No, it's not too expensive. I mean, I don't. Both of these measures are so cheap compared to the risk that we're running that I think you would have to be positively mad not to spend the money.
It's just more expensive.
Yeah, it's more expensive, you know.
Okay, so is the incentives to do that aren't clear?
Well, not only are the incentives not clear, but this is why you need good governance, right? For those who think that markets just simply solve every problem. If competitors are making the decision whether or not to take their spent fuel and put it in dry casks, well, the competitor that decides not to outcompetes the competitor that decides to do it because their bottom line is better. But what you need is good governance to say, actually, you all have to put everything that can go into dry cask storage as soon as it can go for humanity's safety.
Is there anything we can do on an individual level?
Like I say, too expensive
or to avert this crisis?
Yes.
That
Here's
is
what I
fucking
suggest.
insane, bro.
Let's talk about it on podcasts and hope that somebody with power realizes how dangerous this stuff is and starts the correct initiative within.
Money is not gonna mean shit, nigga. If we are all extinct, we can't even live. The planet is gone. What's the dollar bill going, nigga?
Some governmental structure that remembers how to do its job.
How you gonna spend this?
Is there anything else that on it? You know, people often think about prepping and preparing for these kinds of things, digging a bunker under their house and hiding in there, or having supplies.
Well, so look, I think preparing at all scales is a good idea. We face many different scenarios. Some of them aren't survivable. Okay, well, if you've prepared and you hit an unsurvivable scenario, I guess you could make an argument that you didn't make as much of the time you had, but I don't find that very compelling. It seems to me that the low-hanging fruit phenomenon it's the consequence of something that is essentially universal, which is a pattern of diminishing returns, right? Diminishing returns means that over time, if you keep putting the same solution to a problem, you get less and less benefit. But it has a positive side too. A diminishing returns curve has this very steep face on it, right? That face is the bargain face. That's the face where you get a ton of benefit for a small amount of investment. You should certainly do all the stuff up until you get to that point where it goes from a steep face to a plateau. Mm-hmm. So let's just do that, right? Who knows? Maybe the calculations about the galactic current sheet are off because there aren't enough people studying it. We just don't get it yet, okay? Maybe there's 500 more years than we think, right? Maybe there's some factor we haven't found yet that has some impact on the system we don't know. So you should always be doing the stuff that makes you more capable of surviving the disaster, even if you think it's not enough. And then hopefully you discover things are better than you think. So we should be doing that at every scale. And yes, people, should they be preparing? Absolutely. Should they spend everything on it?
I want to see the COVID shit.
Do you prepare in any way?
Oh, yeah.
What does that look
Absolutely.
like for you?
Well, I have little rules for myself. One, I realized, okay, if we were to map out all of the things that I'm worried are a threat, and then you say, well, which are the ones that you're going to have an extremely difficult time affecting your likelihood of surviving it? Okay, I'm going to ignore those.
Yeah.
Right? Why would I spend everything on a solution that's almost certain to fail anyway? Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how well prepared are you for that?
Me? Totally unprepared.
Totally unprepared.
My Tesla outside has like 50 miles left on it, so I wouldn't even be able to get far from here.
Right. So that's not a good plan. But there are things you can do, right? You can, let's put it this way. The power going out for a year, that's a pretty far down the list scenario. That's pretty catastrophic. In fact, I wrote an article for Unheard in which I painted a scenario in which the sun did trigger the collapse of just a part of the North American grid. And I described how that was going to result in the extinction of humanity and approximately how long it would take. It was surprising how easy it was to write it, actually. But could the power go out for 2 weeks? Yeah. How hard is it for you to prepare yourself and your family so that in a 2-week grid down scenario, you'd be able to get through? Well, it depends if it's summer or winter, right? If it's summer, it looks like one thing. You really need food and water. If it's winter, depending upon where you live, you might need to figure out how you're going to generate heat enough to keep you, I would say you want to go beyond alive. You want to get to where your family feels comfortable. But, could you edit down to one room? Could you keep that room warm? How would you do it? You don't want to have to run through that in the circumstance, because a 2-week scenario, I mean, that just simply happens. So anyway, yeah, I think prepping is a great idea for many reasons. For one thing, it's mentally clarifying, right? Just even understanding how dependent we all are on the systems around us makes us better citizens.
So let's say we manage to avoid the solar flare.
Yep.
What else is sort of front of mind for you in terms of concerns at the moment?
I'm very worried about the absolute collapse of our institutions. I cannot think of a single sizable institution that still functions in any meaningful way. Many of our institutions actually function to the inverse of the purpose for which they were created.
When you say collapse of institutions, which institutions are you referring to?
I believe I mean all of them. And I will just give you some examples. In the world I grew up in, there was something called a newspaper.
Yeah.
The newspaper was far from perfect. It reported a lot of garbage. There was a lot of propaganda in it, and there was a lot of wrong-headed stuff that got reported as if it was true. So I'm not pretending that it was a source of facts that one could just simply go to look them up. However, I now live in a world in which the newspapers look like the newspapers I grew up with, but they seem to bend over backwards not to report the news. And then they finally do report the news only when it becomes so embarrassing for it not to show up there that it would reveal how broken they are if it didn't get said. And that's not normal. We should be trying to make sense of the world. You can tell this isn't normal because if there was a newspaper that just simply did what the newspapers of old did, that had a newsroom, it had a budget, we are all quite unsure about what's actually taking place, even just the basic facts. That if there was such an object, I think it's a slam dunk you'd sign up, even if you don't spot it. Because the disadvantage, when other people have access to the facts, just not knowing what it is that they're even talking about, would be sleuthing about the events of COVID. There's the moment at where you can't reach it. So let me take one example. They're in the community of people who ended up sleuthing about the events of COVID. There's the moment at which COVID became a feature of the public discussion at the beginning of 2020. And then there's the moment that it appears to have existed in circulation in the world, which is much earlier. The Wuhan Games in October or September of 2019. If you were privy to the fact that there was a pathogen that was going to circulate, that it was going to result in a major upheaval in people's ability to travel across borders, that people were going to be fearful and locked in their homes, that they were going to be seeking pharmaceutical remedies, whatever. If you had some sense of what was coming, then you could position yourself in the market so that when it did come, you'd make a mint. So the question is, when powerful people did hear in September of 2019 that there was a pathogen that was on the list.
جديد مجموعة سانسن بقوة الكولاجين والهايلورونيك أسيد.
Shut your ass up, bro. I'm gonna get premium chat.
Wide. Was their first instinct to tell the public?
No.
There's a perverse incentive against it. So now imagine that you're ruthless and you recognize that that scenario that I just painted isn't at all unique. Any place where you can get the jump on the public with respect to knowing what's coming is an opportunity to make millions into billions. So maybe you don't want the public to have truth-seeking institutions that work. So this, I think, is liable to be the reason that there's not a single university in the U.S. that still functions.
Really? You think that? You think that's why?
Yeah. I think if you had one university that functioned, then certainly that would be the place everybody wanted to send their kids. I mean, I have 2 college-age kids. If there was a university that still made sense, it's the obvious place for them to go.
Why don't they make sense anymore, in your view?
They don't make sense because, well, there's multiple layers. You've got a scientific apparatus that is very powerful when it comes to finding the truth and very fragile when it comes to resisting perverse incentives.
As in like wokeism and pressures to be politically correct.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
where is the American university that stood up and said, I'm sorry, but men can't become women,
Mhm.
right? They can live as women. They can dress as women. There are surgeries. There are pharmaceuticals. But there's nothing you can do that takes your birth sex and changes it to the opposite one. Not a single university said that anywhere. That's
quite
bizarre.
This is quite personal to you, because I was reading actually earlier today about what happened to you at university at Evergreen State University. And it's funny because I watched the videos of that event. I don't know whether it's because we now have some distance between those events now, but I just want to say I think what you did was the right thing. And I think history has made you look more and more correct as time has gone on, because I watched it and it just seemed to be a bunch of people living in some kind of collective delusion. These like people shouting at you in this hallway. For people that aren't aware, as I wasn't aware before I knew you were on your way here, can you explain what happened there? Because I think it's kind of evidence of this sort of collective delusion that you're talking about.
Sure. There's a little difficulty because there's the public story of what happened, right? The public narrative settled on a set of facts that isn't exactly right. It's not so far off that it doesn't make the point. But the basic thing that happened is that my wife and I were very popular professors at a very liberal school that had a a very unusual teaching model. So the school was called the Evergreen State College. It still exists. The Evergreen State College was founded by radicals who threw out every single structure that would exist in a normal college or university. There were no departments. There were no grades. The administrators did not have the ability to tell you what you had to teach. There were no requirements about how you taught.
Wait, what the fuck?
And if you were the kind of person that was interested in figuring out what new might be done in the teaching environment, if you wanted to figure out a new way to teach, it was the perfect place. That said, many people took the freedom that the college offered and they squandered it. They weren't really interested in doing anything other than reducing their workload. So the college was kind of divided between the professors who thought that this freedom was this gift and we used it. We ended up being popular. And then there were other professors who didn't, and they were much less popular. But in any case, Heather was literally the college's most popular professor.
She's your wife?
Yes. She's my wife and the co-author of that book you have in front of you. She was the most popular professor. I wasn't too far behind. We both had the equivalent of tenure, although the place didn't formally have tenure. It had something like it. And so we were not vulnerable. We were liberated to say what needed to be said. And what happened is the college hired a new president, a guy named George Bridges. For whatever reason, George Bridges wanted to completely reimagine the college as a much more standard, much less interesting place.
That's a brother.
And in order to do
Sam
that,
Porter Bridges.
he didn't really have the power.
I just played fucking what's it called? Death Stranding, chat. I had my first playthrough in probably like 4 years. I haven't touched that game in probably like 4 years. And the nigga name is Sam Porter Bridges, the Walking Dead nigga, Daryl. His name is Sam Porter Bridges in game. So just hearing that right now just kind of reminded me of it.
Because the founders of the college had created a place where the faculty were in a position to just simply say no, and we would have. So what he did in order to overcome the faculty was he impaneled a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, hand-selected, and he incited a, at first, cold and increasingly hot battle over race. It was my job to explain to my colleagues and to anyone involved in the decision-making process why the plan that they were proposing would be a disaster for the college. And although I did have trepidations about standing up because the invitation, and were literally forbidden to intervene. Students started patrolling the campus as if they were the police, patrolling the campus with weapons. They started stopping traffic on a public road passing through campus looking for me. The police called me after to warn me about this, and they told me they couldn't protect me. And
hold on. What?
It was, on fast forward, a test of the claims of these revolutionaries, right? They have this sort of anarchist vibe to them that if we can just simply get rid of the cops, that we will govern ourselves and it will be beautiful. And instead, it became a dangerous, violent riot on the scale of days.
And in 2017, the same year that this happened, you resigned from the college and you got a payout.
Something else, right?
Essentially.
Yep.
I asked this question because we were talking about newspapers, and then we moved to the education system, and you said that there's not a university in the land that's still doing what it's supposed to do. So it felt somewhat correlated, linked to what you were saying, because it kind of sets the backdrop of maybe why you have clear personal experience here, but also what you saw there was kind of a symptom, I think, of some of the pressures that are being applied to the scientific education institution that are stopping it being able to do what it should be doing.
100%. It's doing the inverse of what it should do. It's indoctrinating people. And, the tragedy of it is that the people who are indoctrinated end up hurting themselves.
Yeah.
right? They have an opportunity and they will squander it on a fiction, and in the end, it will not result in them being hireable, right?
Yeah.
They've learned how to demand things of the system rather than to contribute something to it, and that's not their fault. I mean, at some point it becomes their fault, but that's the failure of those who were charged with delivering them an education to do so. It's educational malpractice.
You cited this as one of your big concerns. You started talking about basically the loss of the media. What is the downstream implications of that? Because I just feel like I'll get my media in other places. I'll just go on X. That's not going to cause any issues with society.
Well, I believe the consequence of it is something that I call the Cartesian crisis.
Cartesian crisis.
Cartesian, a reference to René Descartes. And the reason I reference him is that he had a kind of philosophical freakout where he realized that almost everything that he took to be a fact, he had not tested himself. And therefore, all of those facts that felt objective were really downstream of somebody's authority. And he realized how dangerous that was. And in fact, it results in one of his most famous contributions to humanity, which is the what masquerades as a proof of his existence. I think, therefore I am. Now, I don't think it is a very good proof, right? Maybe it works for him. He can prove to himself that he exists, but why we should take his word for the fact that he exists, if a computer said, I think, therefore I am, it doesn't make it true. Mm-hmm. So in any case, we can remember that Descartes was troubled by the fact that he couldn't establish any facts in any way other than to take somebody's word for the fact that that's what they were. We are increasingly living in a world where the chain of logic, of evidence, of reason that might allow us to have some confidence in a fact is breaking down. And this problem is going to get worse and worse. Not only is every single truth-seeking institution captured or broken, but AI is going to change the very nature of what it means for something to be.
It's getting interesting. It's getting interesting.
Right? If you can have a compelling video of you saying something that you never once said,
that is crazy.
Right? Well,
that is wild.
If I show you a video of you saying something last week that you didn't say, you're going to be pretty darn sure you didn't say it. But if I show you something that you said 15 years ago, you may not be so certain. Other people won't be so certain. So what I think this is going to do is going to produce an allergic reaction to belief. And it is going to cause a cynicism about factual material that is going to make it impossible for us to interact with each other, to govern ourselves. It's just, there's no future in a world in which we can't figure out, here is what I believe, and here is why I believe it. All right? That is an essential feature.
Doesn't the internet just become a bit of a wasteland in such a case? And I was thinking of sort of political commentators. Is it likely that there might just become a channel which we switch to, which is a verified channel to watch, Donald Trump or Rishi Sunak or the prime ministers talking, and to get our news source where we know that particular channel is truth, and then we assume that the internet is just a wasteland of misinformation?
Well, the problem is, if you had such a channel, boy, would that be a prize if you controlled it, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you've got the fact channel, then, the world's your oyster. You're now emperor. So were there going to be a fact channel, it would get captured. And that's the world we're living in. Now, I will say the idea that there are no institutions that work is the flip side of another idea, which it goes by the phrase, 0 is a special number. And what I mean by 0 is a special number is that when you have 0 universities that work, 0 newspapers that report the news, 0 social media platforms in which you are allowed to speak freely, one world unfolds. But a single exception in any of those spaces changes the overall dynamic. And the reason for that is because if you had one social media platform in which people were truly free to seek the truth, to discuss anything and everything and nothing bad happened to them and they weren't deboosted or any of that, then that's obviously where all of the people who want an adult conversation are going to go, right? You don't want to be treated like a child. You want to have a conversation in which you can actually entertain all possibilities, reject those for which there's no evidence, etc. So if you get one platform, then people are going to go to it. And if people go to that one platform, it's going to force the other platforms to deliver something similar. So the competitive environment means that a single exception can actually change the whole landscape. And we are in a battle. I don't think X has achieved that status of being completely free, but it's certainly freer than the other platforms. And it is having an effect. It is changing the dynamic. And it is in part why the COVID...
What happened with Ada Ross? With the whole Twitch kick thing? Twitch changed around the whole set of rules. You know what I'm saying? Bitches is streaming with bikinis now and shit. Like, it's crazy.
Narrative broke wide open. Why the political narrative in the U.S. is becoming radically different than it was even a few years ago. So the question is, are we going to see an exceptional university break the trend and become the next Harvard because you'd be crazy to send your kid anywhere else? Are we going to see somebody put together a newspaper in which they get all of the subscribers because you'd be crazy to get your news from a propaganda source when there was a real source? So hopefully courageous people will recognize it's not as hopeless as we are led to believe. A single exception can change the whole dynamic.
I'm actually quite shocked at the impact that Elon buying Twitter, now called X, has had on so many things. And even, quite frankly, the impact I'm starting to see it have on someone like Mark Zuckerberg at Meta. I watched an interview yesterday with Mark, who I think Meta had previously banned Trump from being able to talk on the platform, basically saying that he's pretty badass. And I do not believe he would have been able to say that had X and Twitter not changed.
I agree with you. And I think that actually, if you start looking for other examples of that pattern, you will see them everywhere. There are certain things that once had magical power that no longer do. The claim that somebody is a conspiracy theorist does not cause them to be shunned from society. In fact, my feeling is when I hear somebody is a conspiracy theorist, my question is, oh, are they any good at it? But the same thing is true for the idea of an anti-vaxxer, right? Well, okay, somebody's an anti-vaxxer. Is that because they reflexively believe that no such thing could work? Or is this somebody with an injured kid who has legitimate questions, right? We've just seen the leading proponent of vaccines publish a paper in which he acknowledges that the testing to establish that they were safe was never done. So we're living in a whole different world.
That's crazy.
And I think it's a
cold world we live in.
It is a symptom of Musk primarily having broken the dynamic by, as he said, paying $44 billion because that was the price of free speech.
Billy?
You mentioned AI there.
Broken the dynamic by, as he said, paying $44 billion because that was the price of free speech.
You mentioned AI there. In your sort of list of concerns, pressing concerns, where does AI feel? It feels like it's come out of nowhere, because if we go back about a year, it wasn't really front of mind for anybody, and for the vast population, for the general population. But now it appears to be front of everybody's mind, everyone thinking's mind.
I think that's the right way to view it. I think it should be top of mind, and not because it is independently everything that its worst critics imagine. In fact, I have my doubts about the safetiest crowd and their demands for regulation, but there's plenty to worry about in this space. So I have 5 different existential threats that AI poses. Let's see, off the top of my head, Let's start with the most fanciful first. AI could decide that we are its competitors, and it could leverage its skills and decide to eliminate us. I find that unlikely, but I don't think we can discount it entirely. Second is the so-called paperclip problem, that an AI that was very powerful could have trouble operationalizing a command, and it could result in human extinction. And the example that people who think this way use is if you were to tell an AI you wanted it to make as many paperclips as possible, that it could interpret that as license to go liquidate the universe and turn it all into paperclips. Right? Not what I meant, but but there you have it. And actually, I will give a different example that I think maybe functions better. There are people in our intellectual space who make claims like it would be great if we were to end all suffering. Personally, I think that's about the most insane idea I've ever heard. It's a terrible one. You wouldn't want to live in that world. But you can understand why people think that it might be a moral obligation. Now imagine that you tell an AI, hey, let's end all suffering. Well,
that is a crazy everything
that can suffer extinct.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea that we have a non-trivial problem figuring out how to give a powerful AI an instruction that can't be misunderstood, it's worth worrying about. Again, I think that one's fanciful too, but it should be on our list. But then we get to the three that I don't think are.
Yo, imagine an AI is actually watching these interviews and shit. He be watching the podcast and shit because they say like everything on the internet is accessible. You know what I'm saying? To all these like ChatGPT and fucking all these other, especially 4. ChatGPT 4 definitely watching this shit right now. Yo, ChatGPT 4 definitely watching this shit right now, plotting like a motherfucker. This nigga probably watching the stream. I ain't gonna lie.
Easily dismissed.
That is crazy.
One is that AI is going to enable.
That is fucked. Imagine,
people
bro.
With malign
this
intent.
This nigga says all the solutions. This nigga just listening, bro.
It's going to enable them more than it is going to enable those with benevolent intent. And this is an unfortunate asymmetry that just exists in the world. That an amoral actor, somebody who has no moral compass, they have total flexibility. They can do whatever a moral person can do, and then they've got a whole list of other things that they can also do, right? Whereas a moral person is constrained. They just have the limited set of things that are available to them. So the question is, does AI liberate us all, or does it liberate those who are monstrous more than it liberates those of us who behave like decent humans? I'm concerned about that. I think we are in some danger of it being leveraged against us in a way that transforms things.
I remember hearing a hacker say that the malicious hackers, the people with malicious intent, are always ahead of the sort of ethical hackers that have benevolent attempt that are good. And he was talking about how like the encryption systems and password systems. He goes, the hackers are always ahead, and the defense systems that companies are trying to put in place are always behind, because the hacker's intent is obviously always to find new ways of breaking the current system, whereas the people that defend security systems are just trying to defend against the known forms of attack. So someone in, I don't know, some kid in Russia right now could be at his computer figuring out new ways to use a large language model to attack systems in new ways, whereas the people who are working to defend that are currently just trying to figure out how to mitigate the risks of current weapons. So it's you know what I mean? Like the attackers are always thinking forward, really.
Yep.
Do you think the general public and also just institutions and governments are currently underestimating the profundity and the impact that AI is going to have on the planet?
Yes, and in fact, I think we are crossing over what would be described as an event horizon. So an event horizon, I think the term initially comes from an understanding of what happens at a black hole, that there's a point at which light is pulled back in, and so you can't see beyond it, right? There's literally no mechanism to see beyond it. We are crossing a threshold that none of us can see beyond. And that is inherently frightening. Are people underestimating? They are simultaneously underestimating and overestimating, right? The fear of being turned into a paperclip is overblown, in my opinion. The fear of, well, I've just gotten to the third one on the list. The fourth one on the list is a total collapse in our understanding of the world around us and each other. That the way in which an artificial intelligence interfaces with our human API, with our interface, is profound already. And we're not very far in. Right? I'm already looking at little movies that this thing makes. And I'm not just talking about the clip of the cat walking through the garden, right? Little vignettes. I'm talking about actual movies in which characters of a made-up species are having a conversation about humans, right? Okay. That's a hell of a moment. Where will we be in 5 years? It's unimaginable how much change that is going to create, because we have no evolutionary preparedness at all for living in a world where the product of a computer can outcompete the product of a human in narrative space. That's a dangerous world to live in, because narratives are so profoundly important to who we are.
Stories.
Yeah, stories. Stories are what we're all about. You know, even profound ideas are unfathomable until somebody has written them into a story that people can grok.
But also language just generally is, I don't think, I was listening to something the other day which was just making the case for how our entire society is pretty much held together with language. And it's so interesting that large language models were really the thing that blew open this conversation about AI, because we don't realize that every relationship I have is held together with language. In fact, all my passwords are language. The way that I think, the way that I understand the world is through language. So if there's a super intelligent species that has a better grasp of language and a certain level of autonomy, it's hard to think, it's interesting, because what made us dominate the world was our intelligence and then our ability to collaborate through language and communication. And this is the very thing that AI has entered the scene with.
Well, I will tell you, I wrote a piece, and I keep meaning to release it just so people can see. I didn't get it exactly right, but many years ago, I wrote a piece in which I said that I believed that artificial intelligence was going to emerge from the project to get a computer to translate seamlessly between two languages. And I explained why that would be the thing that cracked the nut. And that is what happened for a reason. The reason is because the relationship between human language and consciousness is profound and largely unknown. So Heather and I described this model in our book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. Human beings are a unique species. The primary way in which we are unique is that if you think about the question about, well, what do human beings do? All right, if I say, what does a tiger do? All right, we could describe the things that a tiger does to meet its caloric needs, to get the materials necessary to maintain its body, to produce offspring, right? We could describe the niche of the tiger. You can't really do that with people, right? What do we do? Sometimes we farm the oceans. Sometimes we hunt big game on land. Sometimes we terraform a piece of territory and we plant crops, We do a lot of different things. And if you think about all the things that human beings have done for our entire history as a species, it's immense, the collection. So we are unlike any other species because our niche is the movement between niches, both over time and across space. So how does that work? Well, we have a tool that no other species has. When you think about the question of what makes human beings special,
Consciousness.
the answer really is language. And the reason that it's language is that language allows the breaching of the boundary between one mind and another.
Awareness.
So that ability allows
aware.
human beings to pool their cognitive capacity. And what Heather and I argue in our book is that the way human beings get through time is they oscillate between two modes. When your ancestors know how to exploit the habitat that you live in, then you take their wisdom in all of the stories that it's encoded in, and you apply it. Maybe you build it out a little bit. You figure out how to do something the ancestors didn't quite know how to do. But mostly what you're doing is just applying the toolkit that you've been handed to the problems that it works on. But what happens when you get on a canoe and you cross some body of water and the place you've landed doesn't have the same plants and animals that your ancestors knew? Well, it's not like they got dumber, but their stuff is less applicable. So what you do is you pool your cognitive capacity, you and all the people in your tribe, and you talk about, well, what are the opportunities here and what might you do about them? I saw an animal this morning and it looked like it might be pretty good eating, but I don't know how you're going to catch one. Well, what if we were to drive it into that canyon, right? That sort of thing. So by pooling our cognitive resources, by reaching a collective consciousness, which is the inverse of that cultural mode of the ancestors, the conscious mode, when we face novelty, allows us to come up with new solutions and then to refine them. And when we've got it nailed, well, then we're the ancestors who knew what to do. And our stories get driven into that cultural layer and they get handed on generation after generation. And then eventually they run out of usefulness and we have to return to consciousness and come up with a new way. So that's what human beings do, both spreading across space and moving through time. They oscillate between that cultural mode of the ancestors and the conscious mode of what the hell do we do now?
So I want to make sure I fully understand this, as if a 10-year-old would understand it, is we have kind of two modes. We have what we had passed to us, and because of consciousness and language and our ability to communicate, we have what we're discovering now about the nature of the world. And I think the very presence of a skyscraper is quite an interesting thing because it's built on the knowledge part.
All right, Chad. I think this far is enough. Hour and 28 minutes and 28 seconds. What are the fucking odds, bro? Anyways, I think we're gonna end it up here. You know what I'm saying? Watch some other shit. You know what I'm saying? I've been trying to I got a couple videos I want to watch. And then I'm gonna dip. It's 1:07 a.m. Yeah, I'm gonna watch this later. WPod. You know what I'm saying?